This week, you're going to read a couple of articles about the community of inquiry model, developed in approximately 2000 by three scholars, Garrison, Archer, and a third whose name I can't remember right now. I studied this in my last sabbatical when I was really interested in developing some understanding of how the community of inquiry model works. And ultimately, it has three components, which I will share with you further in a minute, but those are social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. Together, the three work to create a learning community and a space where learning works. And so that's why there's 3 weeks later in the class that sort of we spend 1 week on each of these parts of the model. Before we really dig into the model, though, the thing that you need to know is that the original authors of the model based much of what they were thinking on the work of John Dewey. And in deference to my colleagues in the Ed department, I will not pretend I know a lot about Dewey other than the very basics that most educators know. And that is that knowledge, according to Dewey, is constructed, not just transferred. And I think, as a faculty, we've moved in that direction absolutely in the very long time I've been at Juniata, from not just our standing up in front of the class lecturing and delivering content into empty heads, but from to us trying to help students develop understanding in interaction with one another and through their own engagement with material. Learning is user-centered, which would follow right from that, and that students should have opportunities to present what they learned in multiple ways other than just through taking tests. This one I think is actually really important as we think about online learning because traditional tests don't always work very well, particularly considering that many people still want to provide exams without open books and with time limits on them. And while we can do some time limit things in Moodle, pretending that students aren't going to look at their texts, it's just a really hard thing to do. So in the tradition of Dewey, one of the things we do when we're thinking about online learning is we try to provide lots of opportunities for students to present what they've learned in ways other than just taking tests. So the idea is in the model, of course, as I said earlier, there are three things. There's cognitive presence, teaching presence, and social presence. Cognitive presence, as defined here from the article that you're going to read this week, is the extent to which learners are able to construct and confirm meaning through sustained reflection and discourse. Okay, so what that means is there's got to be something for them to learn from, and it's got to happen through their reflecting and talking and thinking and writing about those things. Teaching presence is design, facilitation, and direction of cognitive and social processes for the purpose of realizing personally meaningful and educationally worthwhile learning outcomes. That's a mouthful. Basically, this has to do with you, the teacher. How do you design the course and how do you facilitate the course? So, in some research, this part of the model has broken down into actually two factors. When people have factor analyzed research on theory surveys on this stuff, and they've seen that like the design of the course and the facilitation of the course are often two different things in terms of how they function in outcomes related to learning and perceptions of learning. However, it's still treated as one construct because it's all faculty member related. And finally, social presence, or the ability of the participants to identify with the community, communicate purposefully in a trusting environment, and develop interpersonal relationships by way of projecting their individual personalities. That's a big mouthful, but as you can see, that has to do with the community that we create in the classroom, which so many of us are so good at doing in face-to-face classrooms, and students understand how we care about them and how we facilitate their interactions with one another. And that's going to take some thinking about in terms of how we get that done in an online classroom as well. So in terms of research that sort of guides the work of scholars in online learning, this model is pretty fundamental to what most people do. And we're going to direct you to some places where you can look at that research yourself. So a couple things to know about how the different parts of the model work together is that they're obviously not separate from one another, right? And that's why it's a Venn diagram. There's been so much research in this area, but some basic findings that you'll also read about this week are that Teaching presence and satisfaction are related. Cognitive presence and satisfaction are related. Social presence and satisfaction are related. So each of those things separately relates to how students perceive and feel satisfied with their classes, and that cognitive presence is related to perceived learning. Of course, so much of the research in this field has to do with student surveys of their perceptions of their learning. There, and again, I studied this about 5 years ago, so my knowledge is not 100% up to date, but as we all know as educators, it's really hard to understand what students actually learned, right? And we work really hard through SOTL and through conversation with one another to understand how to evaluate learning. And so much of the research in this field still works on how students thought they learned or how faculty thought students learned. Anyhow, one of the things that's important about that is that while cognitive presence is related to learning, there's a mediator there. And so, as you can see in this model, teaching presence, i.e., how you as a professor design and facilitate your course, does impact cognitive presence, that is, how students engage with and learn about the material. There's a mediating variable. So, for those who come from backgrounds where that language isn't second nature, basically what it means is that yes, teaching presence, how you teach and how you design impacts what students learn. However, it impacts that because sometimes of how we develop relationships, and that the opportunity for students to interact with both you and one another completely comes between how and what you teach and how and what they learn. So if the social part isn't there, the learning isn't going to happen as well or as effectively. So one of the things that's important for us to continually think about is how do these three parts of the model work together, and how can we facilitate them working together well for student learning. Finally, here's just one quote from the reading that you're going to do 1 week that says, at the heart of this framework is the idea that community, critical reflection, and knowledge construction are integral to learning, especially online learning. Moreover, the framework, based on the constructs of cognitive, social, and teaching presence, takes into account the various stakeholder groups involved in an online class, the students, the instructor, and the designer. You're both the instructor and the designer with some help from us, and what each can do to make their course a successful learning experience. So later in the class, we'll have 1 week on each of these three areas of the model, and that will help us to think about how we select and develop materials, how we facilitate learning and facilitate interaction between students, and then how we assess and decide whether or not students have learned what we wanted them to. If you're interested, it took me about an hour and a half to make this video from start to finish. After I finished the PowerPoint, I did not have it manuscripted, so I just talked at the camera for about 15 minutes, and then I edited it down to whatever you have here, 8 minutes, 9 minutes. The software I used is called Camtasia. It's fairly cheap, it's fairly easy to learn. It's become more sophisticated over the years since I started using it, so now there might be a little bit more steep learning curve, but it's something that just about anybody could do because I have no background in this stuff, and my videos are not super sophisticated, but they get the job done. And there's also an option in the Camtasia product for you to type in your own subtitles. It takes time. I haven't done it for this video, but that is something that we will talk about later in the semester as well. I'm going to put a link on the Moodle site to Camtasia. Thanks.